Here now with more, Nadwa Al-Dawsari is a researcher and conflict specialist with more than 15 years of experience in Yemen's conflict and development. From London, Baraa Shiban is the Yemen project coordinator for the human rights organization Reprieve. And with us in the studio, Gareth Porter is an independent investigative journalist and author of Manufactured Crisis, the untold story of the Iran nuclear scare. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Nadwa, let me start with you. We just heard from our reporter there, those devastating figures, 10,000 people killed. In fact, other reports tell us that there's many, many more people who've been killed, millions of people being displaced. A brutal war that seems to have been forgotten to a large extent. It doesn't make the headlines every day. What is happening there? Is it coming to an end? Is it getting worse?
I think it's getting worse. The problem with the Yemen conflict is that the people who are trying to help Yemen, they don't understand the nature of the conflict, or they don't want to understand the nature of the conflict in Yemen. The UN and the international community are so fixated on the peace process that's deeply flawed, in which only the traditional elite, who are a huge part of the problem and who are disliked by the majority of Yemenis. The UN peace process currently in place, and that has been since 2011, has not worked because it's not inclusive, because it's other key actors in Yemen are not included in the process.
Right, because the one view we have is that this is a battle between the Houthis and the rest of Yemen.
This is a battle between, actually this is a battle between the traditional, there are two aspects to Yemen conflict. There is the power struggle between the northern traditional elite, and
right.
That includes Saleh, that includes Hadi and his allies in Riyadh, and that includes also the Houthis because they allied with Saleh. And so this is one aspect of the Yemen conflict. The other aspect of the Yemen conflict is the deep grievances and the resentment towards these elite by the majority of the population. Right now, the peace process only focuses on the power struggle between the traditional elite. There is an assumption that these traditional elite will somehow come up with a compromise to end the conflict. But the fact is that these elite were the ones who created the conflict in the first place, and they're not interested in ending the conflict, and they're more interested in sharing power than in ending the war and serving Yemenis.
Baraa, if we look at the humanitarian situation in Yemen right now, as I said, millions of people displaced, millions suffering from malnutrition. You have talked with many, many Yemenis about the situation there. What have you been hearing from them?
I pretty much agree with what Nadwa has described. Mainly, this conflict, at its core, it's a local conflict. It's a civil war, mainly between Saleh. In a way, it's an extension to 2011, when the revolution, we would like to say the youth uprising, happened. Saleh actually signed to step down from the presidency, but actually never left power. And a few years onwards, he managed to use the Houthis and actually gain a huge part of the power, and literally forcing President Hadi to go to the south. And now this is what we're seeing: a conflict between Saleh and the Houthis from one side, and between Hadi and his allies from the other side. In his allies, you could include the political parties, you could include the some of the Southerners, you could include it's a group of allies who aligned themselves around Hadi. Now, in that, you have, of course, the Saudi-led coalition who decided to provide military support to Hadi to regain power. So far, the figures, I think, just by the UN, if we just take the figures by the UN, are so alarming. Many people have been killed, 2.5 million have been displaced, and many people, this is not being reported, but almost 1.5 million have fled the country, and many of them have went even to Saudi Arabia to seek just safety at at the moment. So of course we're looking into a humanitarian catastrophe by all means.
Gareth, as we hear, this is a conflict about domestic politics, a domestic power struggle in Yemen. But how has it become so internationalized? We've got the involvement of Saudi Arabia, the involvement of the United States, the involvement of Iran. It's becoming a very, very big conflict.
Well, first of all, I would have to have a small difference, or maybe a large difference, with the generalization that this is simply a civil war. It obviously does have domestic roots, and there's no question that there has been an ongoing socio-political and military conflict inside Yemen, which involves those local forces. But I think one cannot really understand why this war is happening without looking at it from an international dimension. Understanding, first of all, that this is not just a civil war, it's a war of aggression from outside by the Saudis and the Saudi-led coalition. I mean, they launched an air campaign which involves massive bombardment of civilian areas. Human rights organizations have documented the fact that this bombing has actually targeted deliberately cities that were controlled by the Houthis. Not only that, I mean, the Saudis actually announced publicly that they were doing that. And so this is an extremely clear-cut case of external aggression by the Saudi-led coalition. But then behind them, there's another factor, and that is that it was United States policy which really enabled the Saudis to carry out that war. Without the United States' absolute commitment to supporting the Saudis, this war would not have happened. We know for a fact that the Saudis sent a delegation to Washington before the war started and told the Americans, this is what we want to do, and the Americans gave their blessing. That is, the Obama administration
and their weapons.
Gave their blessing and, of course, provided the weapons. They sold them the bombs previously. When they ran out of bombs, or were threatening to run out of bombs in 2015, the Obama administration agreed to replenish them. And even more important, the United States provided in-air refueling, to the Saudi-led coalition planes carrying out the bombing, as well as assistance in other ways, logistical and intelligence assistance in targeting the places where they wanted to bomb. So the United States is deeply involved, deeply complicit in this war of aggression in Yemen. And this is the aspect of it that tends to get lost in the coverage, I'm sorry to say.
Right. Nadwa, as Gareth points out, the United States is deeply involved, but do the Saudis and the United States have the same goal? Because on the one hand, we have this civil war that's going on. On the other hand, the United States says it's attacking Al-Qaeda targets in Yemen. I want you to take a listen. We just talked about that raid that took place just a couple of weeks ago. I want you to listen to what the White House said about that raid. Let's watch this.
The raid, the action that was taken in Yemen was a huge success. American lives will be saved because of it. Future attacks will be prevented. The life of Chief Ryan Owens was done in service to this country, and we owe him and his family a great debt for the information that we received during that raid. I think any suggestion otherwise is a disservice to his courageous life and the actions that he just took. Full stop.
So the American view of that was that this was a raid against terrorists. There's no mention, there was absolutely no mention of the rest of the war that's going on there.
Yeah, there were at least a dozen children and women killed in that raid, and they were definitely not Al-Qaeda. In addition to the civilian casualties, the raid happened in an area that is contested between the Houthis and the local tribes. And this was not the first time. Back in 2014, when Houthis pushed into the same area, to Al-Bayda, to Rada, part of Al-Bayda, the drone strikes helped tip the scale in favor of the Houthis because they targeted Al-Qaeda elements, but they also killed a lot of tribesmen who were fighting the Houthis. And that created a huge perception that the U.S. is supporting the Houthis against local tribes. So when this raid happened and it killed civilians, and it happened in an area that's contested between the Houthis and local tribes. It reinforced this perception. And the perception there is that the U.S. supporting the Houthis as part of a larger, this is the perception, as part of a larger U.S. policy in the region that's pro-Iran, Shia, and anti-Sunnis. So this is damaging. I mean, for Yemen, it's damaging. It doesn't help. It's not going to help solve Al-Qaeda problem because you can't raid your way out, Al-Qaeda out of Yemen like that. But also, excuse me. But also, it reinforces it creates deep anti-American sentiment. And the problem between this raid and the drone strikes before is that people somehow understood that when drone strikes killed civilians, they were not intentional. Now the perception is that the U.S. is killing Yemenis intentionally in favor of the Houthis and Iran.
I just wanted to add that this raid is, there haven't been very many raids, obviously. There are very few of them. But every time the Special Operations Forces of the United States have intervened directly on raids or fired missiles to supposedly kill Al-Qaeda operatives, they have, 3 of the 4 times, they have committed horrible errors, either killing large numbers of civilians or killing a popular deputy chief of a province who was trying to mediate a dispute. And so I think the point here is that United States military simply does not understand the situation in Yemen. They do not have the understanding or the accurate intelligence to be able to carry out such raids. They simply should be stopped. I mean, this is really of vital importance.